Betrayed by his ambitious protégé, a veteran geologist was stripped of his hard-earned pension and banished to a rotting, mosquito-infested swamp island meant to break his spirit. But nature has a funny way of delivering justice. When a historic drought drained the marsh, it revealed an absolute empire. Harrison Caldwell had given 32 years of his life to Belmont Stratton Resource Group. As their senior field geologist, he had mapped out multi-million-dollar copper veins in the Andes and spearheaded zinc extraction projects in the harshest Canadian tundras. He was a man who lived out of a canvas duffel bag, trusting the dirt under his boots more than the men in tailored suits back at headquarters. But his unwavering loyalty to the company was precisely what blinded him to the knife inching toward his back. The blade was wielded by Preston Gallagher, a newly appointed vice president of operations, who was exactly 30 years Harrison's junior. Preston was a man who had never swung a rock hammer or slept in a site trailer. He possessed an MBA from a pristine Ivy League institution and a ruthless compulsion to cut overhead costs to artificially inflate quarterly profits. Harrison's upcoming retirement package, a robust legacy pension secured during a bygone era of corporate generosity, represented a massive red line on Preston's immaculate ledgers. To Preston, Harrison was not a founding pillar of Belmont Stratton. He was an expensive liability that needed to be surgically removed. The setup was a masterclass in corporate sabotage. During the preliminary surveys for the lucrative Oconee Valley project, critical soil stability reports were quietly altered. When a minor landslide caused a $3 million delay, Preston immediately convened an emergency board meeting. He presented an impeccably forged paper trail that pointed directly to Harrison's supposed negligence. The young executive stood before the board, feigning deep regret as he projected Harrison's falsified signatures onto the boardroom screen. Summoned to the top floor of the Chicago headquarters, Harrison walked into a room devoid of the colleagues he had known for decades. Instead, he faced Preston and Richard Belmont, the exhausted CEO who had long surrendered the actual running of the company to his aggressive young executives. Preston slid a severance agreement across the mahogany table. The terms were brutally clear. Harrison was officially fired from his senior position, effective immediately. If he signed the paper, he would resign quietly, forfeiting his entire legacy pension, and walk away with a meager 6-month severance. If he refused to resign, the company would fire him with cause, entangling him in a web of corporate litigation that would bleed his savings dry. But Preston, smiling with all the warmth of a coiled viper, offered a third option, a technicality designed purely to humiliate. Belmont Stratton owned a 400-acre parcel in the deep south known as the Mudden Tract. It was acquired decades ago in a convoluted bankruptcy settlement and was entirely composed of useless, stagnant marshland. Preston offered Harrison a reassignment as the site custodian of the Mudden Tract for the remaining 2 years of his contract. If Harrison could survive 2 years living in isolation on the worthless swamp-filing daily soil compliance logs, he would hit his retirement date and secure his pension. It's a generous compromise, Preston had sneered, straightening his silk tie. Take the severance and enjoy your golden years, or go live in a swamp. I'm sure a tough old dirt kicker like you will love the humidity. Preston expected the old man to break to sign away his life's work in defeat. He did not account for Harrison Caldwell's sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. Without breaking eye contact, Harrison picked up his pen, firmly crossed out the resignation clause, and signed the reassignment addendum. He was going to the swamp. 2 weeks later, Harrison stepped off a rented, flat-bottomed skiff onto the rotting wooden dock of the Mudden Tract. The reality of his exile was far worse than any corporate document could convey. The island was a miserable mound of waterlogged peat and twisted cypress roots, surrounded by miles of murky, tannin-stained water. The air was thick enough to chew, smelling of decaying vegetation and stagnant mud. The only structure was an abandoned duck hunting cabin that leaned precariously to the left, its tin roof rusted through and its walls actively being devoured by termites. His first night was a descent into psychological hell. The heat was completely suffocating, trapped beneath a dense canopy of Spanish moss. Swarms of aggressive mosquitoes seeped through the warped floorboards, forcing Harrison to sleep inside a suffocating nylon netting while listening to the oppressive, deafening chorus of bullfrogs and the occasional heavy splash of an alligator hunting in the shallows. Every morning, driven by a cocktail of spite and survival, Harrison waded into the knee-deep muck to collect the mandatory soil samples. It was an exercise in utter futility. The dirt was nothing but decomposed organic sludge, completely devoid of commercial value. He was forced to document the exact acidity and moisture content of the useless mud, scanning the reports via a spotty satellite connection, straight to Preston Gallagher's inbox. It was a daily ritual of submission designed to make him quit. As the months dragged on, the physical toll became undeniable. Harrison lost 20 pounds. His hands were permanently stained with dark peat, and his joints ached from the constant dampness. He spent his evenings staring out at the endless expanse of brown water, drinking cheap whiskey from a tin cup, and wondering if his pride had finally written a check his aging body could no longer cash. He was entirely alone, exiled to a forgotten corner of the world, serving a sentence in a prison made of mud and spite. But even in his darkest moments of isolation, Harrison Caldwell refused to let a man like Preston Gallagher win. He dug his boots into the rotting porch, promising himself he would survive the swamp, even if it took everything he had left. 14 months into his exile, the world around the Mudden Tract began to shift. It started subtly, an anomaly noticed only by a man who had spent every waking hour observing the minute details of his prison. The oppressive daily afternoon thunderstorms that usually pounded the tin roof suddenly stopped. A heavy, dry stagnation settled over the southern basin. Meteorologists on Harrison's crackling battery-powered radio began speaking in urgent, hushed tones about a massive atmospheric blocking pattern. A historic, once-in-a-century drought was gripping the entire region. Week after week, the sun beat down with relentless, apocalyptic fury. The humidity, usually a suffocating blanket, evaporated into a harsh, arid heat that cracked the bark of the ancient cypress trees. For Harrison, the drought brought a terrifying new reality. The shallow, murky waters surrounding his island began to retreat. At first, it was just a few inches a day, leaving behind a foul-smelling ring of dead aquatic weeds. But as the rainless weeks turned into 3 brutal months, the evaporation rate accelerated violently. The sprawling swamp, which had stood impassable for centuries, was literally being baked out of existence. By the 16th month of his exile, the water had vanished entirely. The Mudden Tract was no longer an island. It sat elevated above a vast, desolate expanse of cracked, sun-baked mud. The once deafening chorus of the swamp had gone completely silent, replaced by the eerie, hollow sound of dry wind howling through the dead reeds. Harrison's flat-bottomed skiff sat uselessly in a trench of hardened clay. If he wanted to leave the cabin, he no longer needed to wade through sludge. He could simply walk across the floor of the vanished marsh. One afternoon, desperate to escape the sweltering confines of the cabin, Harrison took a walk across the newly exposed basin. The ground was severely fissured, breaking into geometric plates under his boots. He wandered nearly 2 miles from his cabin, navigating through the skeletal remains of sunken logs and the bleached bones of stranded fish. It was there, at the deepest depression of the former swamp, that his trained geologist's eye caught something entirely out of place. The mud in this specific channel was different. It wasn't the dark, organic peat of the surrounding basin. It was coarse, sandy. He knelt down, brushing away the top layer of baked crust. Beneath it lay a sprawling, heavily compacted bed of black sand and smooth, river-worn quartz cobbles. Harrison's heart skipped a heavy beat. This wasn't swamp detritus. This was a paleo-channel, an ancient high-energy riverbed that had been buried under the stagnant marsh for thousands, perhaps millions of years. Trembling slightly, Harrison pulled his folding entrenching tool from his belt and hacked into the hard-packed gravel. He scooped a heavy clump of the black dirt into his canvas sample bag. He didn't dare let himself believe it. The geological conditions were impossible. This region was classified by the Bureau of Land Management as an entirely sedimentary basin, completely devoid of precious metals. But the heavy, dense iron sand clinging to his fingers told a different story. He rushed back to the cabin, ignoring the searing heat. He dragged a rusted, galvanized steel wash basin onto the porch and poured in his precious drinking water. Grabbing an old plastic dining plate to serve as a makeshift gold pan, Harrison dumped the sample of black sand into the water. His hands shook as he began the familiar, rhythmic, swirling motion he hadn't used since his days prospecting in the Yukon. He aggressively washed away the lighter silts, letting the muddy water spill over the edge of the plate. He isolated the heavy black iron sands, swirling the remaining water in a tight circle, gently coaxing the densest materials to the bottom edge. As the black sand fanned out across the white plastic, Harrison stopped breathing. There, sitting at the very tail of the black sand, was a bright, unmistakable streak of brilliant buttery yellow. It wasn't pyrite, it wasn't mica, it was raw, heavy, jagged placer gold. And it wasn't just a few specks. The tail was thick with it, coarse flakes, and small nuggets that gleamed aggressively in the harsh southern sun. Harrison collapsed back into his rotting chair, staring at the plastic plate in utter shock. The math racing through his head was staggering. If a single random scoop from the surface yielded this much color, the bedrock of that ancient river channel, where the heaviest gold would naturally settle, was likely holding a king's ransom. The swamp hadn't just been a stagnant pool. It had been a natural settling trap, catching and hiding heavy minerals washed down from the northern mountains over millennia. Suddenly, a terrifying realization washed over him, colder than any winter wind. He was sitting on a massive, unrecorded gold deposit, but he was standing on land owned by Belmont Stratton. If Preston Gallagher saw even a hint of this in the mandatory weekly reports, the company would immediately terminate Harrison's contract, seize the discovery, and claim the glory. Harrison sprinted inside and tore through his battered filing cabinet, pulling out the original corporate deed to the Moodin tract that he had been given upon his exile. He scanned the dense, archaic legal jargon. The company had acquired the land during a timber bankruptcy in 1988. He read the clauses carefully, tracking the specific legal boundaries. Then he saw it. A massive, glaring loophole birthed by corporate arrogance. Belmont Stratton Group only held the surface and timber rights to the Moodin tract. Because the land was universally deemed a worthless ecological dead zone, the company had never bothered to spend the extra capital to secure the subsurface mineral rights. Under the archaic but still active provisions of the General Mining Act, the mineral rights on this specific classification of undeveloped tract were open to public claim. Preston Gallagher, in his desperate attempt to punish Harrison with a worthless piece of paper, had unwittingly handed him the keys to an absolute fortune. Harrison did not send his soil report that evening. Instead, he powered up his satellite phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 10 years. The line clicked, and the gruff voice of Arthur Penhaligon, a ruthless, independent mining attorney based in Denver, echoed through the receiver. "Arthur." Harrison said, his voice completely steady, a sharp smile finally breaking across his weathered face. I need you to quietly file a federal mineral claim for me. And I need you to do it before the men in Chicago realize I just struck the motherlode in their garbage dump." Arthur Penhaligon was not a man who asked unnecessary questions. Operating out of a steel and glass office in downtown Denver, the fiercely independent mining attorney understood exactly what his old friend was proposing. Harrison Caldwell had essentially found a gaping oversight in Belmont Stratton's legal armor, a blind spot born of pure corporate hubris. Because the Mudden Tract was acquired through an obscure 1988 timber bankruptcy, the original deeds fell under a fragmented interpretation of the Stock-Raising Homestead Act. The suits in Chicago owned the dirt on top, the dying cypress trees and the mosquitoes. But the subsurface minerals, the ancient gold-bearing gravel hidden beneath the baked clay, belonged to whoever staked the federal claim first. Working strictly through encrypted satellite calls late at night, Harrison and Arthur established a blind shell corporation named Ironclad Placer Holdings. To the outside world, Ironclad was just another faceless entity registered in Wyoming, represented entirely by Arthur's legal firm. On paper, Harrison's name appeared nowhere. He was simply a hired contractor, acting as a proxy for the corporation. Arthur immediately filed the heavy paperwork with the Bureau of Land Management, locking down the mineral rights to the entire 400-acre basin. Executing the legal maneuvering was only half the battle. Harrison still had to survive his exile and secretly map the massive gold deposit while trapped under the watchful, vindictive eye of Preston Gallagher. Every morning, Harrison meticulously logged onto his corporate laptop and drafted aggressively boring soil compliance reports. He detailed the high acidic pH of the peat moss, the tragic mortality rate of the local bullfrogs due to the drought, and the absolute structural uselessness of the baked mud. He fed Preston exactly what the young executive expected, to see the depressing diary of a defeated, broken old man waiting to die in a swamp. Nights, however, belonged to the phantom miner. As soon as the sun dipped beneath the tree line and the brutal southern heat broke, Harrison transformed. He abandoned his corporate uniform, strapping on a headlamp with a red light filter to avoid drawing attention from any distant highways. Armed with a heavy pickaxe, a specialized trenching spade, and thick canvas buckets, he marched out onto the dry, cracked lakebed. Digging through the baked upper crust was agonizingly slow work for a man in his 60s. His hands, already calloused from decades of fieldwork, cracked and bled in the arid air. But adrenaline and pure, unadulterated vengeance fueled his muscles. He excavated a series of deep, narrow test pits along the ancient Paleo Channel, confirming his wildest theories. The gold was not an isolated anomaly. It was a massive, concentrated alluvial fan. Heavy spring floods from millions of years ago had relentlessly driven coarse nuggets down from northern quartz veins, depositing them right into the natural depression of the Mudden Tract. Processing the pay dirt required absolute stealth. Harrison dragged heavy buckets of gravel back into the densest thicket of remaining trees near his cabin. He built a small rudimentary sluice box out of scavenged porch floorboards and lined it with ribbed rubber floor mats stolen from his useless corporate skiff. Since the swamp was completely dry, he had to rely on a small gas-powered water pump connected to a deep, muddy artesian well he had dug by hand. The chugging of the small motor was muffled by a barrier of dead branches he had deliberately stacked around his covert processing station. Within 4 weeks, Harrison had isolated over 90 ounces of raw, jagged placer gold. He used a portable butane camp stove and a graphite crucible to melt the coarse flakes into crude, heavy buttons, removing the black iron impurities. During a mandatory supply run to a rural post office, his only approved excursion off the tract every month, he securely mailed the heavy parcel to Nathaniel Ross, a trusted precious metals broker and assayer in Colorado. Nathaniel liquidated the gold, quietly wiring nearly $200,000 into ironclad Placer Holdings' new bank accounts. The operation was now entirely self-funded. Back in Chicago, however, a dangerous variable entered the equation. Preston Gallagher, reviewing the quarterly budgets, noticed that Harrison Caldwell had somehow survived 18 months in the swamp without a single formal complaint. Preston's predatory instincts flared. Desperate to find a breach of contract that would allow him to fire Harrison right before the 2-year pension vesting date, Preston dispatched a corporate field auditor. Jeffrey Collins, a sharp-eyed junior compliance officer, arrived completely unannounced on a rented all-terrain vehicle. He roared across the dried basin one Tuesday afternoon, armed with a clipboard and a mandate to aggressively inspect the mud and tract for any OSHA or environmental violations. Hearing the distant roar of the ATV engine, Harrison had precisely 10 minutes to hide an active, highly lucrative mining operation. Moving with the frantic energy of a man fighting for his life, he kicked dirt over his crude smelting station, shoved his heavy canvas bags of raw gold beneath the loose floorboards of the rotting cabin, and threw a heavy algae-stained tarp over his wooden sluice box. When Jeffrey finally pulled up to the sagging porch, Harrison was sitting in a rusted folding chair, wearing a stained undershirt, slowly sipping tepid instant coffee. He looked every bit the exhausted, defeated custodian. "Mr. Caldwell," Jeffrey announced, stepping off the ATV with a smug corporate posture that mirrored his boss, Preston. "I'm here for a surprise compliance audit. I need to see your daily logbooks, your chemical storage protocols, and your water sanitation setup. Mr. Gallagher wants to ensure you aren't violating any EPA mandates out here." "Help yourself, kid," Harrison muttered, waving a tired, dirty hand toward the miserable interior of the cabin. "The logbooks are on the desk. Watch out for the brown recluse spiders near the filing cabinet." Jeffrey spent 3 excruciating hours tearing through the cabin, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking directly over a fortune in raw gold hidden beneath his polished leather boots. He inspected the dried lakebed, complaining loudly about the oppressive heat before finally giving up in disgust. He found absolutely nothing. Watching the auditor drive away in a cloud of dust, Harrison allowed himself a slow, jagged smile. The final hurdle had been cleared. The federal patents for the mineral rights arrived from Arthur the very next day. The trap was set, and Chicago was completely blind to the bomb waiting beneath their feet. Time suddenly became the ultimate weapon in Harrison's arsenal. The final 6 months of his exile passed in a blur of grueling, secretive labor and meticulous legal preparation. He completely mapped the subterranean boundaries of the Paleo Channel, proving that the richest concentration of heavy nuggets ran directly under the exact center of the Belmont-Stratton property line. He hoarded the processed gold, allowing his covert corporate accounts to swell into the millions. Day 730 finally arrived. The 2-year reassignment contract officially expired at midnight. Harrison Caldwell's legacy pension, worth nearly $4 million in secured corporate bonds, irrevocably vested into his personal accounts. Preston Gallagher wasted absolutely no time. At precisely 8:00 a.m., the satellite phone rang. Harrison answered it on the porch, watching the morning sun illuminate the vast, dry empire he now secretly controlled. "Well, Harrison," Preston's voice dripped with condescension, "you survived. I have to admit I'm surprised you didn't quit. But your contract is over. The company no longer requires your services as a custodian. Pack your bags. A transport will pick you up tomorrow. Enjoy your retirement." "I intend to Preston," Harrison replied smoothly, his voice devoid of the anger the younger man so desperately wanted to hear. "I'll leave the keys on the desk." Returning to civilization, Harrison flew straight to Denver, finalizing the legal traps with Arthur Penhaligon. They didn't have to wait long for the catalyst. 3 months after Harrison's departure, Belmont Stratton announced a massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure pivot. Desperate to salvage their sinking quarterly margins, CEO Richard Belmont had authorized a radical plan to build a massive inland logistics and shipping hub. The proposed location for their state-of-the-art concrete complex, the newly dried, highly stable, completely empty Mudden tract. Bulldozers and heavy excavation crews were immediately dispatched to the Deep South. But the moment the first Belmont Stratton excavator broke the dried crust of the swamp, a federal marshal stepped out of an SUV and slammed a court-ordered injunction onto the foreman's chest. Panic erupted in the Chicago headquarters. Preston Gallagher was dragged into Richard Belmont's private office, frantically trying to explain why their billion-dollar project was completely paralyzed by an emergency federal cease-and-desist order. They are called ironclad placer holdings. Preston stammered, his immaculate suit suddenly feeling very tight as he reviewed the legal documents. They hold a fully recognized federal mining patent for the subsurface mineral rights. They claim our logistics hub will permanently obstruct their access to a commercial gold deposit. Who owns the mineral rights to our land? Richard roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. How did we not secure the entire deed? It was an ecological dead zone. Preston pleaded, sweating profusely. There is no gold in a sedimentary swamp. It's a shakedown, Richard. A legal troll operation. I'll squash it. I've already invited the CEO of Ironclad to negotiate a surface access buyout. We'll cut them a check and make them go away. The emergency summit was scheduled for the following afternoon in the primary executive boardroom. Preston and Richard sat at the head of the massive glass table, flanked by a small army of corporate litigators. They expected to bully a small-time legal opportunist into submission. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Arthur Penhaligon strolled in first, carrying a thick leather briefcase. But it was the man walking right behind him that sucked the oxygen entirely out of the room. Harrison Caldwell, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his face deeply tanned from 2 years in the brutal southern sun, walked to the opposite end of the table and took a seat. Complete, suffocating silence blanketed the room. Preston's jaw went entirely slack, all the blood draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. Richard Belmont stared in sheer, uncomprehending bewilderment. "Harrison," Richard finally choked out. "What are you doing here?" "Good afternoon, Richard," Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am the majority shareholder and acting director of operations for Ironclad Placer Holdings." "This is illegal," Preston suddenly shrieked, leaping to his feet, his composure entirely shattered. "This is corporate espionage. You were an employee of this company." "I was a custodian," Harrison corrected sharply, locking eyes with the man who had tried to ruin him. "A role you specifically designed to humiliate me, Preston. My contract explicitly stated my duties were restricted to surface maintenance and soil logging. I had no exploratory mandates. What I did on my own time discovering a heavy paleo channel that your pathetic preliminary surveys missed was entirely within my rights as a private citizen." Arthur opened his briefcase and tossed a thick stack of certified geological assays across the table. They slid directly into Richard Belmont's hands. "Take a good look at those numbers, Richard," Harrison continued, leaning forward. "That worthless swamp your VP exiled me to is sitting on an estimated $40 million of easily accessible heavy placer gold. I own the rights to every single flake. If you try to build your logistics hub, you violate my federal mining patent. I will tie you up in federal court for a decade." Richard Belmont skimmed the glowing assay reports, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up at Preston, his eyes filled with absolute murderous rage. Preston had not just lost them a fortune, His arrogance had completely compromised the company's flagship infrastructure project. "What do you want?" "Harrison," Richard asked, quietly defeated. "Two things," Harrison replied, leaning back in his chair. "First, Ironclad will lease the surface rights back to Belmont Stratton so you can build your concrete hub. But you will pay me a 30% gross royalty on all displaced material during your excavation. You are essentially going to pay your own construction crews to dig up my gold and hand it directly to me." Harrison paused, letting the brutal financial reality of his demand settle over the room. "And the second thing?" Richard asked heavily. Harrison looked directly at the trembling, pale vice president. "Preston leaves this building today. No severance, no golden parachute. You fire him with cause for catastrophic negligence." Preston opened his mouth to protest, but Richard Belmont cut him off without even looking at him. "Done. Get out of my boardroom, Preston." Harrison Caldwell walked out of the Chicago headquarters an hour later, stepping into the brisk afternoon air. He had walked into the building 2 years ago, a betrayed, targeted man. He walked out today as a multi-millionaire, his pension completely secured, his rival utterly destroyed, and an empire of gold waiting for him in the southern sun. Revenge truly is a dish best served with a heavy slice of irony. Harrison Caldwell proved that when corporate greed tries to bury a seasoned veteran, they might just dig up an absolute fortune instead. Never underestimate the sheer willpower of a man with nothing to lose and a pickaxe in his hand. If you loved this unbelievable tale of swamp gold and ultimate payback, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life dramas.